Hey everyone, welcome back to The Bookworm. I'm Dimitri, and today we're talking about Thomas Pynchon's Inherent Vice. So, I would describe Inherent Vice as Thomas Pynchon's breeziest novel, or most readable novel, and yet using those terms breezy and readable feels wrong when you're trying to describe Thomas Pynchon's writing, and so that's something I'm going to dive into pretty soon. What is this book about? At a very basic plot level, it's about a pot-smoking hippie detective who is helping his ex-girlfriend, who he might still be in love with, to find her current boyfriend, who is a major real estate tycoon that is missing, or actually I think when she goes to him, is about to go missing. This book is often compared to The Big Lebowski, because I think of the hippie pot-infused mystery behind everything. However, even though it's not a mystery, I think this book is more appropriately connected to Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Fear and Loathing, like I said, is not a mystery, but both books are dealing with the end of the 1960s and what the end of the 1960s symbolizes, and what the end of the 1960s actually means for America. So that's the big idea, right? What does the 1960s mean, right? What does the end of it mean? I can't speak too much to what that means for Fear and Loathing or Hunter S. Thompson, because I read that book more than a decade ago. But for Pynchon, it means a few different things. It means the end of Pynchon's version of the American dream. It's the end of a lot of different forms of idealism, and those ideals are exchanged for greed and unfettered capitalism. And I think Pynchon interprets the 1960s as the moment, the end of it, as the moment when we reached a state of no return for capitalism, or for the present day form of capitalism that we see and that we are currently entrenched in. And so I talked about the forms of idealism that we lost in exchange for this unfettered capitalism. I think the biggest one that Pynchon is trying to grapple with is the loss of this communal dream. Now, I can't really give that a good definition without really having you read the book, but there's this communal dream, I think, for a better future, for a more ideal world to live in, as a community and not as individuals. And that's the important part there. It's also, capitalism was gained at the expense of a culture, at the expense of experiences, and at the expense of the natural environment. And that's an important one I want to talk about just briefly. Thomas Pynchon writes historical novels. But when he's writing a historical novel, Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon, even Bleeding Edge, I think all of his novels are historical novels. When he's writing about a historical novel, he's giving a critique of the contemporary world. And so this takes place in the 1960s, but he wrote it in 2009. I'm going to be talking about what he's critiquing, but I think one of the more obvious ones is the environmental degradation that we are maybe more aware of now. Was written into the storyline for the end of the 1960s. And so I think there is this connection that Pynchon wants us to see between the end of the 1960s and what that cost us today. So I think all these topics I just listed are the most interesting part of the novel, right? These themes, these topics that Pynchon is trying to grapple with here. But first I need to discuss why Inherent Vice is called Pynchon Light. Before I go deeper into it, there is that stereotype maybe that exists with this book that it is the easy reading version of Pynchon. And I agree with that sentiment and I disagree with it, and I'll explain why. But anyways, the phrase I think was first used, or at least most notoriously used, in the New York Times review of this book, where the author said, in this novel, paranoia, which is this common repeated symbol in all of Pynchon's novels, And usually has a really deep meaning behind it that you have to go through layers to kind of uncover. But in Inherent Vice, the New York Times says, it is less a political or metaphysical state than a byproduct of smoking too much weed. So the author there is saying paranoia usually means something deeper in Pynchon novels, but in Inherent Vice, it's just very simple, and it's just a device for someone smoking too much weed and getting paranoid. And that's simple, and there's nothing really below the surface there. I agree and I disagree with that sentiment. The novel very much feels like Pynchon took notes from all of his other novels, and read all the reviews on how complex and confusing Pynchon can be, and he took those critiques to heart and tried to make something a little bit easier. It really feels that way. Like he's trying to write a more readable version of his storytelling. He has less characters than in previous novels. One very central character. Where in Gravity's Rainbow, we have, I think, literally a new character every 2 pages. I think there's 600 or 300 characters in there, and it's like 600 pages. And the main character in Gravity's Rainbow fades in and fades out of the story for large swaths of time, where we have one central character and we never really leave his perspective. It makes it a little bit easier to understand and comprehend. There is a more central plot. It's the most straightforward plot that I've read by Pynchon, and that is, saying a lot, right? Pynchon's plots don't really matter as much in his other novels. I mean, they matter, but things go bonkers really fast. Where things go bonkers, but we're still tied to the major plot in Inherent Vice. And then there's small chapters in here. There's no chapters in Gravity's Rainbow. It's just small sections, big sections in there. And then there's a central romance. And actually, that was one of my favorite things in Gravity's Rainbow, was that romance between Roger Mexico and Jessica that fades out in the later part of the book, but was just really compelling and well written, and I wanted more of it. And Thomas Pynchon seemed to have taken that note, right? Like, let's have a central romance in here. I didn't enjoy the romance as much, but it, yeah. Anyways, not something that most people probably would go to Pynchon for, but that is an interesting note, I think, that he took, right? So it feels more readable for a lot of reasons. And being readable is not a bad thing, right? It takes a certain level of genius, I think, to be complex and understandable. And I don't think this novel is as complex as Gravity's Rainbow or The Crying Lot 49 or his other novels, from what I gather. This novel just feels less complex, and there's less deeper insights. So I don't know. When I was reading this book, I felt really good. I really liked the reading experience a lot at first, because I struggled through large patches of Gravity's Rainbow to get through that, and felt very challenged by it. And this book was mostly fun and easy to get through, and it made me feel really smart because I'm reading Pynchon again, but now all of a sudden it makes sense to me. And that was a great feeling. And then as I got through the midpoint of the book, I realized it's not really me, it's the book. The book is less complex. The book is less deep, less genius than Gravity's Rainbow. And I know I'll probably get a lot of flack for that. And that's more or less why this book is called, appropriately so, Pynchon Light. I want to talk more about the more interesting elements of the book. I want to talk about why I think this book had potential to be great, and then just ends up being, I think, I would still classify as a good book. And it's because it doesn't dive deep enough into these topics I'm going to bring up. So I said earlier, when Pynchon writes a novel, it's typically a historical novel, he is using that piece of history to critique something that is currently happening, a contemporary issue. So this book is about the end of the 60s. We discuss how the end of the 60s could mean, the nail in the coffin, where ideals about a communal system faded away, and stark individualism replaced those ideals, where things were sold off for corporate gain, for unfettered capitalism, essentially. So why is Pynchon writing about this now, right? He lived through the 60s in Southern California during these moments. Why does he think in 2009 we need to be reminded of how we got to where we are, of how capitalism rose to the level that it's at? Which I think is his point with writing this book. Well, in 2009, we should remember that date. What was going on, right? The book was published in 2009. In 2008, we had the U.S. housing crash, right? There was the housing bubble. Tons of people lost their houses because of bank foreclosures, risky, maybe inappropriate lending patterns by banks, and so on. And this sent off a global wave, right? This did not just affect the U.S., it affected the entire global market, and there was a reckoning of how business is done and how government is interacted in that. Okay, so we have this global market crash. I don't think that is random. I don't think it's random that I'm saying this book is written in 2009, therefore Pynchon's writing about the 2008 market crash when he's writing about the 1960s. I think it's appropriate because there are large parts of this book that deal with real estate. The person that Doc Sportello, the main character, is trying to find, the main mystery, is what happened to this real estate tycoon. And what did the real estate tycoon want to do? Well, he lived most of his life gaining from this capitalist system, gaining from real estate. But then he dates this hippie chick and changes. And he wants to now donate his land for a communal profit. Not profit's wrong word there, but a communal gain. And he goes missing, and part of the mystery is, why is he missing? Who would want him to go missing, right? Who does it threaten if a bunch of private property ends up becoming free land for people to use? What system does that threaten? What people does that threaten? And that's the mystery, the more interesting part, I think, of Inherent Vice. And I think that relates to kind of our economic system, how we got to the 2008 market crash, what led to that, right? We had, I think in Pynchon's eyes, this one chance to make sure we didn't follow that road, but because the 60s, the idealisms, the hippie movement, which Pynchon was kind of a part of, failed. And it failed to stop this movement towards idealism, towards greed, and towards unfettered capitalism. So yeah, he touches on the rise of real estate. He touches on how private property led to a loss of this kind of communal environment in our America, in our systems. There are, these two forces in the novel. There's the forces represented by Doc Sportello, which is the hippie idealism, and then there is the straight-laced cop represented by Bigfoot, and he represents conformity to and individualism and maybe corporate greed, right? Along with those two characters, we also have two symbols that are opposing forces to one another. They seem similar. Doc and Bigfoot, we end up seeing how similar they actually are, but we also have these two smoke image symbols. One is the pot smoke, and that clouds dock, and the other is the fog or the smog that surrounds Los Angeles. So the pot smoke, I think, represents the nonconformity, the collective dreams for a better future, for maybe a communal future, not an individual private property future. And then we have Bigfoot, and we have who's the cop, and we have the smog in Los Angeles that gets referenced often in this book. And I believe that represents the loss of community, with the high rises coming into Los Angeles, with real estate bubbles popping up. The smog sets in, and as we enter our private property, we commune less with others outside of it. We become more individualistic, and we shut ourselves off from people that are not like us. And I thought it was an interesting duality between those two characters and those two symbols, and that's why I disagree with the New York Times review of this book that says pot smoking is just pot smoking in this book. I think there is a deeper symbolism here. I do think Pynchon could have gone deeper with the symbols, but they do exist, and they are dealt with, I think, in a very interesting way. Okay. So I think Pynchon's writing this because he feels like he bore witness to this pivotal time, right? And the reason why we are at, this state where the global market is reckoning with itself was maybe from something that Thomas Pynchon felt like he witnessed, that he bore witness to. So what actually causes the end, right? What causes the end of the hippie movement of the 60s, of this idealism? The two symbols that which are also events, real actual events, in this book that are repeated often are the Watts riots and the Manson murders. And I think these both represent not an external ending of the hippie movement, an external ending meaning police cracking down on hippies, people and locking them up and dispersing of protests and other things like that. I think it's the internal disruption, what happened within the movement. So the Manson murders is maybe a little bit easier to draw a connection to the internal corruption of the hippie dream or the hippie movement, which Pynchon has written about in other places. He left the 60s hippie groups because he became disillusioned with them. But the Manson murders represent hippies that turned the hippie dream into a pretty literal hippie nightmare. I think Tarantino deals with this in his Once Upon a Time in Hollywood movie to an extent, and I think it's an interesting choice that Pynchon made as his point marker for how the 60s ended, right? Certain hippies got too wrapped up in nonconformity and pot smoke, and maybe were more susceptible to these kind of cult-like Mansonoid figures, as they say in the book. The Watts riots, for me, was a little less obvious, and I had to do a little bit more digging to understand why the Watts riots represented the end of the 60s and the end of this idealism. I think it does help to read Thomas Pynchon's article that he wrote for the New York Times, actually, in the 60s, where he's reporting, or commenting at least, on the Watts riots. Even if you don't read Inherent Vice, I highly recommend you read this. It's very well worth it. Pynchon doesn't really, in what I've read, deal with race in quite like this in his other novels. I won't say I dislike the way he deals with race. I don't really have an opinion on how he deals with race because it's not as, I think it's mostly non-existent from the novels I've read. But he deals with race really interestingly in this essay. So it's a different side of Pynchon that I haven't seen. And it feels in a lot of ways like it could have been written today. Race relations in America today. So read that. I'll link it below, the article that Pynchon wrote for the New York Times on the Watts riots and race relations. He, in that essay, and he doesn't dive into it in Inherent Vice enough. He just mentions the Watts rights, but he doesn't say why it represents the end of this idealism, and I wish he did. But he writes about this moment that felt like this protest. It felt like an opening up of two worlds, or a moment when he realized that America was actually two different places. There was a white world and there was a black world. And the hippie movement, for all of its talk about unity and progress and this communal dream and these communal ideas, had major blind spots when it came to race. Pynchon describes the white world, as one where young people can look to escape and with little consequences. They can take drugs with little consequence. Where the black world is one that is steeped in reality, that mistakes can have larger consequences, and you can't find escapes, actually. You can only find brief glimpses of calm within the reality, but you're just steeped in the reality of your situation. He also writes in that essay interesting things about private property, which I think will complement reading this book, whether you read that essay before, during, or after. He also talks about race relations and police. It's really well done, really astute observations, and I wish those observations, I wouldn't have minded. He wrote that in the 1960s. This was written in 2009. I wouldn't have minded if he just copied and pasted some of those lines into here, but he doesn't address those issues with the same, I wouldn't even say dexterity, but the same comprehension even in Inherent Vice. And that was disappointing after I read that essay. I knew what he was capable of. I knew he was poking at it, but he didn't get to it, and that was disappointing. So I don't I don't dislike leaving negative reviews for books, but I'm a little nervous on how people might react. Ultimately, I will say I did enjoy this book. I'm glad I read it, and I would recommend it as a great entry point into Pynchon. I just liked everything else that he's done better, and I haven't read everything. I've read Gravity's Rainbow, I've read The Crying of Lot 49, and a few of his short stories, and I hope to continue my adventure with Pynchon. But I do think everything else I've read has been better than Inherent Vice. This has been fun, but it wasn't the depth that I was looking for that was in his other novels. Let me know, maybe there's something else that I missed, or tell me something else that you gained from it, and that would be great. It was a fun book. I would still recommend it. It's a lot quicker of a read, so if you're hesitant about Pynchon, it's definitely worthwhile for that. So anyways, that's my review. I do want to do kind of a quick life update and what's in the pipeline, if for this channel. So I haven't recorded a video in a while, and I kind of like keeping it sporadic, at least for now. This is mostly a fun thing for me. But I got married this past summer. Finally, we had to postpone from last summer. And I went to Alaska for my honeymoon, and it's been an amazing couple months. Ultimately, because of that, I haven't read as much as I'd like to, but I did do some reading about Alaska, or books I would associate with Alaska. I might do a video on that. I'm reading In Search of Lost Time, which is kind of a terrible thing to read when you're trying to focus so much on planning a wedding and everything else in life, but it has been very rewarding. I might do a video on the first two books. I've only read those two. And yeah, those are some things that are coming up. Anyways, I hope you guys like this video. Subscribe if you want to, and have a good day.